This story is titled, My Girlfriend Tried to Use Me for My Savings, so I Destroyed Her and the Fraud. She was helping. Hey guys, I don't usually post stuff like this, but I need to get this off my chest. I'm Carter, a 30 years old guy, living in a mid-sized city. I work as a financial analyst, not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays well and gives me a sense of security. Over the years, I've managed to save up a decent amount of money. Nothing extravagant, just enough to feel like I've got my life together. Growing up, money was always tight in my family, so having a safety net has been a priority for me. For about a year now, I've been dating Brielle. She's 28 and has this vibrant, fun personality that drew me in right away. She always seemed like the kind of person who could walk into a room and make it a party, even if there were only 3 people there. Brielle told me she worked as a freelance graphic designer, which sounded cool. I didn't really ask for details. It wasn't like I needed a rundown of her day-to-day life. Things were great at first. We had fun together, and she seemed genuinely supportive of my work and goals. Brielle wasn't materialistic or flashy, at least not on the surface. She didn't demand fancy gifts or expect over-the-top dates. It felt like we were on the same page, or at least close enough that it didn't matter. Then, a couple of months ago, things started to feel different. It was a random Tuesday morning, and I was in the kitchen making coffee like usual. Brielle walked in, leaned against the counter, and casually brought up my savings. You know, your savings could really help us both level up. I chuckled, thinking she was joking. I didn't know why she was suddenly thinking about my savings, but when I looked at her, she wasn't laughing. Her face was serious, like she had just suggested the most reasonable idea in the world. I'm serious, Carter. If we're really committed, why not combine our finances? I didn't know what to say. I just kind of stood there for a second, staring at her. We weren't living together. We weren't engaged. Marriage hadn't even come up. Combine finances? It felt so sudden. So I asked, what do you mean by that? Brielle shrugged, like it was no big deal. I just think if we're serious about building a future together, pooling our resources makes sense. We could do so much more together than apart. I told her I wasn't comfortable with that idea. I tried to explain that my savings were something I'd worked hard for, and I wasn't ready to merge them with someone else's, especially when we weren't even living together. Her reaction caught me off guard. She rolled her eyes and said, Wow, you really don't trust me. Do I have to be your wife for you to trust me? It wasn't like I'd accused her of anything. I just didn't think it was the right time to have that kind of conversation. I didn't yell or get defensive. I just calmly explained that I wasn't there yet. But she seemed annoyed, like I just insulted her. Carter, I'm not asking to drain your account, she said, crossing her arms. I just think it's weird that you're so protective of it. If we're building a future, what's the point of keeping things separate? I didn't want to argue, so I just said, I hear you, but I'm not comfortable with it right now. She sighed and walked out of the kitchen, muttering something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. That conversation stuck with me. It wasn't like I thought she was after my money or anything. I mean, I didn't want to think that. But something about the way she brought it up, like it was just assumed we'd pool our finances, didn't sit right with me. Later that day, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I'd overreacted. People talk about money in relationships all the time. It's normal to have those conversations as things get more serious. But the thing was, Brielle and I hadn't even talked about moving in together, let alone marriage or combining finances. It felt like skipping a bunch of steps. Still, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Relationships take work, and I figured this was just one of those awkward topics you have to navigate. So I decided to let it go. But the next day, things felt off. Brielle wasn't acting upset or anything. If anything, she was more affectionate than usual. She made breakfast, something she didn't normally do, and was all smiles. I chalked it up to her trying to smooth things over after our talk in the kitchen. But then she said, I was thinking about what we talked about yesterday, and I really think you should reconsider. It's not like I'm asking for everything. I sighed and put my fork down. Brielle, it's not about you asking for everything. It's just, I'm not ready to make that kind of change. She gave me this look, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. So what? You don't see us having a future? That question hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't that I didn't see a future with her. I wouldn't have dated her for a year if I didn't think we had potential. But tying finances together felt like a completely different level of commitment, one we hadn't even talked about. It's not about that, I said carefully. It's about timing. I'm not ready for that yet. Brielle didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded, grabbed her plate, and walked into the living room without another word. For the next few weeks, things between Brielle and me started to shift in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't outright fights or cold shoulders, but little moments that felt off. She kept bringing up my savings, but it wasn't like she sat me down for another serious talk. Instead, she dropped comments here and there, always in this casual tone, like she was testing the waters. One evening, we were scrolling through Netflix, trying to pick a movie. Brielle saw a travel documentary and said, Wouldn't it be amazing to just take a month off and explore Europe? Like stay in boutique hotels, eat at Michelin-starred places, the works? I laughed and said, yeah, sounds great, but my savings aren't for spontaneous luxury trips. She tilted her head at me. But that's what savings are for, isn't it? To enjoy life? What's the point of saving all that money if you're just going to sit on it? I shrugged. It's for the future. Big stuff, like buying a house or dealing with emergencies. She sighed dramatically and leaned back on the couch. I just think it's sad to hoard money instead of making memory. You only live once, Carter. I let it slide, but it stuck with me. It wasn't like I never spent money. I paid for plenty of our dates, bought her thoughtful gifts, and treated us to weekend getaways. It just felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough to convince her I wasn't some miser. Then came the dinner with friends. It was supposed to be a fun night. Good food, a few laughs, and a chance to unwind. At first, everything was fine. We were joking around about silly stuff. But out of nowhere, Brielle turned the conversation toward finances. You know, Carter guards his money like a dragon with its hoard, she said with a grin, looking around the table for laughs. Everyone chuckled and someone said, hey, that's not a bad thing. At least he's responsible. I forced a laugh, but I could feel my face heating up. I didn't want to make a scene, so I let it go in the moment, but I felt like she'd just put me on display. Talking about my savings like that, especially in front of people who didn't know the full story, felt invasive. After dinner, on the drive home, I brought it up. Hey, I didn't like you making a joke about my savings like that. It's personal, and I don't think it's something to talk about in front of others. Brielle didn't even hesitate. Oh, come on, Carter. It was just a joke. You're so sensitive about this stuff. Maybe if you loosened up a little, you wouldn't feel so defensive. That stung. I locked eyes with her. Sensitive? Let me make something clear, Brielle. Being careful with what I've earned isn't being sensitive. It's called being smart. If you think mocking me in front of my friends is some kind of joke, then maybe you're the one who needs to reevaluate what respect looks like. She froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard by my tone. She didn't have anything to say, and we both stayed silent all the way back home. By this point, I started noticing other things that didn't sit right. Brielle was on her phone constantly, which wasn't unusual, but what caught my attention was how she acted when I was nearby. If I walked into the room while she was texting, she'd quickly lock her screen or flip the phone over. I thought she was feeling down after our last conversation. One night, I casually asked, who are you always texting? She glanced up, just friends. You know how group chats are. Constant updates about nothing. I nodded, pretending to buy it, but it didn't feel like the whole truth. There were also her work calls. Brielle had always said she was a freelance graphic designer, but I never saw her actually working. No sketches, no drafts, no client meetings over Zoom. She'd just tell me she had a call, grab her headphones, and step outside. When she came back, she'd act like nothing had happened. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but as the days went on, the strange behavior piled up. One evening, we were supposed to have dinner together, but Brielle texted me last minute saying she had a big client meeting and couldn't make it. I told her no problem and decided to pick up takeout instead of cooking. As I was driving home, I passed a small cafe near our place and happened to glance inside. There she was, sitting at a table with some guy I didn't recognize. They were leaning in close, talking like they were deep in conversation. It wasn't like they were holding hands or anything, but the sight of them together felt weird. I parked the car and sat there for a minute, trying to figure out what to do. Should I go in and say hi? Should I ask her about it later? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I drove home and waited for her to get back. When she finally came home, she was all smiles, talking about how productive her meeting was. I asked, how'd it go? Great, she said. The client loved my ideas. I think they're going to sign a long-term contract. Who was the client? Oh, just someone I've been working with for a while. Nothing exciting, she said, brushing it off. I didn't push, but I couldn't shake the image of her sitting with that guy at the cafe. Who was he? Why hadn't she mentioned him? A few days later, I decided to casually bring it up. We were watching TV, and during a commercial break, I said, hey, I saw you at that cafe the other night. Who were you meeting with? Her expression didn't change, but there was the tiniest pause before she said, oh, that was a coworker. Sometimes it's just easier to meet in person than do everything online. It sounded reasonable enough, but something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. I let it go, but the pieces weren't adding up, and I was starting to wonder if I'd missed something big. I tried to focus on work and let the weird feelings slide, but then something happened that I couldn't ignore. A random email landed in my inbox. It was late on a Tuesday, and I was going through my work emails when I noticed one that stood out. The subject line read, follow-up on overdue account. At first, I thought it was spam, but as I skimmed the message, I realized it was addressed to Brielle. It mentioned an overdue balance from a project she was supposedly involved in, and the sender seemed to think I was her. Confused, I read it again. The email didn't come from a big-name company, just some generic-sounding business. Still, it raised a question. Why would someone send me an email meant for Brielle? More importantly, why was there an overdue account tied to her name? She'd always said her freelance work was stable, and she never talked about struggling with payments. I debated whether to bring it up with her, but something told me to dig a little before saying anything. So I replied to the email, pretending to be her. I wrote, "Hi, could you provide more details about the account and the balance? Thanks." Within an hour, I got a response. The sender attached an invoice listing the balance owed and included a note about how they'd been trying to reach Brielle for weeks. At the bottom of the invoice, I saw a contact name, Jake Matthews. The name unlocked a core memory I hadn't revisited in years, one that came rushing back with all the bitterness and tension I'd felt at the time. Jake wasn't just a former colleague. He was the embodiment of one of the ugliest chapters in my career. Years ago, he worked at my company, and I'd uncovered that he'd been falsifying expense reports, stealing thousands over several months. At first, it didn't seem possible. Jake was charismatic, the guy everyone liked, someone who could spin a story so well it felt like the truth. But the numbers didn't lie. When I confronted him during the investigation, the friendly mask fell away, replaced by hostility and venom. "You've been gunning for me from the start," Jake snapped in that meeting. "You're the problem, not me." His words echoed in my head for weeks afterward, his anger radiating as though I'd destroyed his life on purpose. The investigation was airtight, and HR fired him the same day. But Jake didn't go quietly. As security escorted him out, he stopped in front of me, locking eyes with a glare I still couldn't forget. "You think you've won? You're going to regret this." I'd tried to dismiss his threat as desperate anger, but deep down, it unsettled me. Jake's belief that I'd singled him out and ruined him wasn't just an excuse, it was something he'd held on to, probably for years. Seeing his name on that invoice now, it was clear the resentment hadn't faded. I felt a mix of unease and anger. Jake had been the one stealing, lying, and betraying the company's trust, but in his mind, I was the villain. He had always been smug, manipulative, and convinced of his own victimhood. But now, after all these years, it seemed he'd found a way to step back into my life. This wasn't just bad luck. Jake Matthews wasn't done with me, and knowing him, this was only the beginning. But why was his name on an invoice tied to Brielle? For the rest of the night, I couldn't focus on anything else. I wanted to believe it was some weird coincidence, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Brielle had never mentioned knowing Jake. As far as I knew, their worlds shouldn't have overlapped at all. The next day, I did something I wasn't proud of. I started looking through Brielle's stuff. She wasn't home, so I checked her laptop, hoping to find some clarity. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just emails with clients, design files, and the usual clutter. But then I noticed a folder buried in her email drafts labeled Proposals. Inside, I found a chain of emails between Brielle and Jake. The messages started out professional enough. He'd apparently hired her for some graphic design work months ago. But as I read further, the tone shifted. They weren't just talking about work. "Thanks for having my back," Jake had written in one email. "I know it's risky, but I couldn't do this without you." Another email from Brielle said, "You've been through so much, Jake. I believe in you. We'll figure this out together." My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a client relationship. There was something personal between them. That night, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. All the weird behavior, the secrecy, the lies. It all seemed to lead back to Jake. But the question was, why? The next day, while Brielle was out, I decided to do more digging. This time, I searched her phone. It wasn't easy. She always kept it locked, but I'd seen her enter the code enough times to know it. What I found confirmed everything I'd been afraid of. Her texts with Jake weren't just casual. They were intimate, both emotionally and otherwise. He wasn't just a former coworker or client. He was someone she cared about deeply, someone she was clearly involved with behind my back. In one thread, Jake wrote, "I can't stop thinking about you. You're the only good thing in my life right now." Brielle replied, "You don't know how much that means to me. I feel the same way, Jake. I just need a little more time, and we'll figure this out." Another message from Jake read, "Does he even notice how distant you've been? You should be here with me, not wasting your time with him." Her response, "I know. I hate lying, but it'll all be worth it soon. I'm doing this for us." She wasn't just betraying me, she was fully invested in him, emotionally and physically. And to make it worse, Jake was married. He was running this whole scam on me while still playing husband at home. I sat on the couch, gripping my phone so hard I thought it might crack. The texts stared back at me, every word igniting a fire in my chest. This wasn't just betrayal. It was deliberate, calculated, a slap in the face from both of them. Jake wasn't just some scorned ex-employee. He was a parasite, using Brielle as his pawn to get back at me. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. but I forced myself to stay in control. Losing my cool wouldn't fix this. I needed to be sharper than ever to make them pay for what they'd tried to do. I started connecting the dots. The comments about my savings, the constant pressure to share finances, the secrecy. It wasn't just about Brielle wanting security. It was about Jake trying to exploit me through. That realization hit harder than anything else. Brielle wasn't just a girlfriend who'd strayed. She was actively working with someone who hated me, someone who wanted to tear me down. When Brielle came home that evening, I could barely look at her. She walked in, smiling like nothing was wrong, and said, "Hey, how was your day?" I forced a smile and said, "Fine. How was yours?" "Busy," she said, kicking off her shoes. "Lots of work stuff. You know how it is." I nodded, fighting back the urge to confront her right then and there. I wasn't ready yet. I needed time to figure out my next move. That night, my mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? How much had she told Jake about me? And most importantly, what was their endgame? But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let this slide. The next morning, I had a plan. I wasn't going to let them play me any longer. It was time to take control of the situation and find out exactly how deep this betrayal went. I woke up early, still running through the texts and emails I'd uncovered. Brielle was asleep beside me, completely unaware that I knew everything. It wasn't just her betrayal, it was the fact that she'd teamed up with, among all men, Jake, a guy whose sole goal seemed to be ruining me. I needed more details. I wasn't going to confront Brielle until I had the full picture, so I decided to dig deep. That day at work, I started researching Jake. He'd been off my radar for years, but it wasn't hard to find him online. His social media accounts were mostly inactive, but I found a LinkedIn profile that claimed he was a consultant for small businesses. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd been fired for fraud, and now he was offering advice to others. I noticed he'd listed a few vague projects he'd worked on, and one of them had a familiar name. Brielle's supposed freelance design business. My stomach churned. They weren't even trying to hide their connection. I dug into Jake's history and wasn't surprised by what I found. The guy had been sued twice in the past couple of years for unpaid debts, and he'd been evicted from an apartment just 6 months ago. Classic Jake, always biting off more than he could chew, and then crying about how life wasn't fair. It all made sense now. He wasn't just out for revenge, he was flat out broke. And somehow this idiot had managed to convince Brielle to play along. Maybe he spun her some sob story, or maybe she just fell for his pathetic act. Either way, she threw everything away for a stupid jerk who couldn't even keep his own life together. When I got home that evening, Brielle was already there, lounging on the couch with her phone. She looked up and smiled like everything was normal. "Hey babe," she said. "How was work?" "Busy," I replied, trying to keep the peace. "How about you?" "Oh, same old," she said, shrugging. "Just trying to keep up with client demands." I nodded, biting back the urge to call her out right then and there. Instead, I said, "You've been working a lot with that guy Jake, right?" Her expression changed. "Yeah, a little." "Why?" "Just curious," I said, keeping my tone casual. "What's he like?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "He's fine. A little intense sometimes, but that's how creative people are." I pretended to accept her answer. Inside, I was boiling. She was lying to my face, and I didn't know whether to be more angry or disappointed. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about consolidating some of my accounts, just to see how Brielle would react. Her eyes lit up immediately. "That's a great idea," she said, a little too enthusiastically. "It's always good to have everything in one place. Makes it easier to manage." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Yeah, I might even open a joint account at some point. You know, for shared expenses." Brielle's smile widened. "That makes so much sense. Honestly, I think it's the kind of step that shows commitment. Like, it's not just about money. It's about building something together." I felt disgusted. She was practically salivating at the idea, completely unaware that I was testing her. Over the next few days, I started putting more pieces together. I reached out to a friend who worked in private investigation, not for anything formal, just some advice. I told him about Jake and Brielle without giving too many personal details. My friend didn't hesitate. "If this guy's got a history of fraud, he's probably already planning his next move. People like that don't stop. They just get more creative." He suggested I monitor my accounts closely and look for any signs of unauthorized activity. He also recommended documenting everything I'd found so far, just in case things escalated. That evening, I went through every financial account I had, checking for anything unusual. Thankfully, everything was still secure, for now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on borrowed time. I also started keeping a record of everything Brielle did that seemed suspicious. Every time she left the house without explanation, every time she locked her phone when I walked into the room. It all went into a notebook. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. Eventually, I'd have to confront her, but I wanted to be prepared. I wasn't just dealing with Brielle. I was dealing with Jake, and I had no idea what he was capable of. So a few nights later, I had my moment. Brielle came home from one of her work meetings, smiling as she put her bag down. "Hey, babe," she said, like nothing in the world was wrong. I didn't smile back. "We need to talk." Her expression flickered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Sure, what's up?" I motioned toward the table, where I'd laid out all the evidence, printed texts, emails, and the transaction history from her secret account. I watched her eyes dart across the papers, her smile fading with every second. "What is this?" she asked, confusion and defensiveness. "You tell me," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been lying to me. And not just lying, working with someone who has it out for me." Her face went pale. "Carter, I didn't let her finish. Don't even try to deny it. I know about Jake. I know about the payments, the texts, the emails. I know everything." She looked genuinely panicked. "It's not what you think," she stammered. "I can explain?" "Then start explaining," I said, folding my arms. She sat down, her hands shaking. "Jake reached out to me a few months ago. He said you ruined his life, got him fired, blacklisted. He was desperate, Carter. He needed help." I leaned forward. "So you decided to help him scam me? That's why you were asking for my savings? You thought that was the solution?" "No," she said quickly. "It wasn't like that at first. He just wanted advice, someone to talk to. But then, I don't know, it got complicated. He convinced me you were this heartless guy who didn't care about anyone but yourself. He said he needed to get back on his feet, and you believed him," I cut in. "You believed a guy who committed fraud over me, the person you were supposed to care about." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't think he'd actually what?" I snapped. "Use you to manipulate me? Because that's exactly what happened, and you let it happen." The conversation spiraled from there. Brielle kept trying to defend herself, saying she'd been manipulated and didn't realize how deep it would go. But the more she talked, the clearer it became that she wasn't as innocent as she wanted me to believe. She knew what Jake was doing, and she went along with it anyway. At one point, she tried to flip the script. "You've been so closed off, Carter. You never trusted me enough to share anything about your life. Maybe if you'd been more open, I wouldn't have felt the need to help him." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I leaned back in my chair, crossed my arms, and smirked. "So, let me get this straight. You're blaming me for protecting my own money? That's your defense?" I let out a dry laugh. "You've got some nerve, Brielle." Her face crumbled, and the waterworks started, full-on dramatic sobbing, the kind of performance that might have worked on me a year ago. But now? Now it was just noise. "Save the tears," I said, standing up and pointing toward the bedroom. "Pack your things. You made your choice the moment you sided with Jake. Now, you can deal with the fallout. I'm done." She dropped to her knees. "Carter, please, I made a mistake. I love you. I didn't mean to hurt you." I looked down at her, unimpressed. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have lied to my face for months. You wouldn't have schemed with another man to try to rob me blind. That's not love, Brielle. That's betrayal. And I don't forgive betrayal." She tried to argue, but I cut her off with a sharp wave of my hand. "Don't waste my time. Pack your bags and go." It took her forever to gather her things, mostly because she kept stopping to beg me to reconsider. I didn't move an inch. I watched her like a hawk. Every excuse, every apology, every tear, none of it fazed me. When she finally reached the door, she turned back, her voice trembling. "You'll regret this," she said, trying to sound strong but failing miserably. "You'll realize I was just trying to help." I let out a low chuckle and leaned against the frame. "The only thing I regret is not seeing through you sooner." Then I swung the door shut and locked it without another word. That was it. Done. No hesitation, no second guessing. She was gone, and I felt nothing but relief. With Brielle out of my way, I turned my attention to Jake. He wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. He wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could play dirtier. I wasn't just going to send him a message. I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. The first thing I did was dig out his wife's contact information from when he worked at my company. I didn't even hesitate this time. She deserved to know what kind of snake she was married to. I put everything together. Screenshots of the texts, the secret bank transfers, the emails where he and Brielle planned to manipulate me, and sent it all to her. No sugarcoating, no softening the blow. Just the cold, hard truth. Within 2 days, I got a reply. It wasn't long, but it hit hard. "Thank you for this. I've suspected for a while, but now I know for sure. He won't get away with this." That was all she needed to say. I knew she'd handle it from there, but I wasn't done yet. I reached out to every professional connection I had, colleagues, old bosses, anyone who might come across Jake in their circles, and made sure they knew the truth. I told them how he'd committed fraud at my company, how he'd tried to use Brielle to con me out of my savings, and how he was still pulling his schemes even now. It didn't take long for the word to spread. I made sure everyone knew that Jake was a liar and a fraud, someone who couldn't be trusted under any circumstances. His reputation, what little he had left, was in ruins by the end of the week. I thought that would be the end of it, but then I heard through a mutual contact that Jake had been fired from whatever dead-end job he'd managed to land after his first disaster. Apparently, when his boss got wind of what I'd shared, they didn't even wait to hear Jake's side of the story. They just cut him loose. And the best part? His wife kicked him out too. Turns out this wasn't his first shady stunt, and the evidence I handed over was the final nail in the coffin. He was out of a job, out of a home, and out of people to con. It was poetic justice. Jake, the self-proclaimed mastermind, brought down by his own stupidity. Even with Jake out of the picture, I'd be lying if I said the betrayal didn't sting. This guy had worked for me, someone I'd once trusted, and he spent months scheming with Brielle to tear me down. It wasn't just business, it was personal, and that made it hit harder. As for Brielle, she didn't go quietly. Over the next few weeks, she tried everything. Long, desperate texts, voicemails where she swung between apologizing and blaming me, and even showing up at my apartment one night. She cried on my doorstep, begging for another chance. I didn't even open the door. I watched her through the peephole for a second, then walked away. She wasn't worth my time or energy. Eventually, the chaos they'd brought into my life started to fade. I focused on myself, on moving forward, and on piecing everything back together. For the first time in months, things felt normal again. But then, one evening while running errands, I saw them. Brielle and Jake together again, sitting on the curb outside a dingy gas station. They looked like they'd been through hell. Jake was hunched over, scratching at his arms, muttering to himself like he wasn't even aware of where he was. His clothes were filthy, and he had this hollow, sunken look in his face that screamed rock bottom. Brielle was slumped against the wall next to him, pale and gaunt, holding a cracked pipe in her trembling hands. Her once bright, confident energy was completely gone. She looked drained, like whatever fight she'd had in her was long gone. It hit me immediately. They weren't just down on their luck. They were on drugs, hard drugs. I paused for a second, just taking it all in. A part of me thought about walking up to them, saying something like, "Look where your big plan got you," or rubbing it in their faces that they'd lost everything. But as I stood there, I realized I didn't need to. They'd already destroyed themselves. I walked past them without a word, head held high. The satisfaction I felt wasn't from their suffering. It was knowing I'd come out on top. They tried to take me down, and instead, they took themselves out. I'm free now, free from their lies, their schemes, and their pathetic attempts to mess with me. I took control, exposed their true selves, and left them in the rubble of their own choices. They had to think twice before crossing me.